10 years, 1,000 dead, 2 miles of solid granite. In 1875, a drill bit broke through the last 18 inches of rock inside Hoosac Mountain in Massachusetts. Men on the east side heard tapping from the west. They stopped their hammers. They listened. Through 2 miles of stone, through a decade of death, they heard the rhythm of other men's work, the men they'd been digging toward since 1855. Some of them cried. Most were too exhausted to celebrate. They'd entered that mountain as young men. They emerged gray, broken, lungs full of granite dust that would kill them within years. A foreman named Bernard Donahue, who'd worked the tunnel since 1863, supposedly said 4 words when the breakthrough came: "About damn time." But here's what makes this story more than a tale of engineering triumph. Before Hoosac, no one had ever attempted anything like it. No tunnel this long, no rock this hard, no technology adequate to the task. They started with hammers and hand drills, the same tools Moses might have recognized. They ended with nitroglycerin, a substance so unstable it killed the men using it almost as often as it killed the mountain. And Hoosac wasn't alone. Across America, from the Sierra Nevada to the Alleghenies, men were carving tunnels through mountains that should have been impossible to pierce. The Transcontinental Railroad alone required dozens of them. The most famous, Summit Tunnel in California, was carved almost entirely by Chinese laborers, men lowered in wicker baskets over 1,000-foot cliffs to drill blast holes in granite faces. This is the story of how America tunneled through its mountains before dynamite made such work almost routine. The tools, the methods, the bodies left inside the stone, and the tunnels that still carry trains today, 150 years later, through passages carved by men whose names we've mostly forgotten. Let's start with what they were up against. The problem wasn't just rock. The problem was specific kinds of rock in specific places where the railroads had no choice but to go. The Sierra Nevada, the Berkshires, the Alleghenies, the Rockies, every major mountain range in America stood between the coasts, and the railroads needed to connect those coasts. Going around added hundreds of miles, millions of dollars, weeks of travel time. Going over required grades so steep that locomotives couldn't climb them, or couldn't haul anything useful if they did. The only option was through. But through meant granite, gneiss, schist, rock so hard that a steel drill bit dulled after inches of progress, rock so dense that black powder charges barely cracked it, rock so massive that the mountain seemed to go on forever, solid and unbroken. Summit Tunnel, the longest on the Central Pacific route, it required cutting through 1,659 feet of solid granite at an elevation of 7,000 feet. The rock was so hard that workers averaged 8 inches of progress per day. 8 inches. A man could dig faster through packed earth with his bare hands. The Hoosac Tunnel in Massachusetts stretched nearly 5 miles, 25,081 feet of mixed rock, much of it the hardest granite in New England. When construction began in 1851, engineers estimated 3 years to completion. It took 24. And these were just the famous tunnels. Dozens of smaller bores dotted every mountain crossing, each one a war of attrition between human beings and geology. The rock didn't care about deadlines. The rock didn't care about investors. The rock just sat there, ancient and patient, while men broke themselves against it. A geologist named Charles Hitchcock surveyed the Hoosac route in 1854. His report was optimistic about the project's feasibility, but included one line that proved prophetic. "The mountain will resist," he wrote. "It has been resisting for 400 million years." Now let's talk about how they fought it. The basic technique hadn't changed in 3,000 years. One man held a steel drill bit against the rock face. Another man swung a hammer, an 8-pound sledge, and struck the end of that bit. The holder rotated the bit slightly between each blow. The striker swung again. This was called double jacking, 1 inch per hour. That was good progress. On the hardest granite, half an inch. A team of 2 men working a full shift might advance 4 to 6 inches into solid rock. Behind them came the powder men, packing black powder charges into the holes. A fuse, a retreat to safe distance, an explosion that might crack the rock enough to remove a few cubic feet of stone. Then the muckers moved in, shoveling broken rock into carts, hauling it out of the tunnel, and the drill teams moved forward again, 1 inch at a time. The rhythm was everything. The holder kept his hand steady on the drill. If he flinched, if the striker missed, fingers shattered and careers ended. The striker found a pace he could maintain for hours, the sledge rising and falling in arcs that became automatic, meditative, mind-numbing. A holder named James Callahan worked the Hoosac heading for 6 years. He never missed a shift until the day a striker named O'Brien, new to the work, like still finding his rhythm, brought the hammer down 3 inches to the left of the drill. The blow crushed Callahan's right hand. He never worked underground again. They called the holders steel drivers. The term would later become famous in the legend of John Henry, a steel driver who supposedly raced a steam drill and won, and died. The legend was rooted in the real experience of real men who held steel while hammers fell toward their knuckles, knowing that trust in their partner was all that stood between them and crippling injury. But here's the thing about double jacking in a tunnel. The rock wasn't the only enemy. The air was death. Every hammer strike on every drill bit created rock dust, fine particles of granite that hung in the still tunnel air. The men breathed it in shift after shift, year after year. It coated their lungs, it scarred the tissue. It slowly, steadily suffocated them from the inside. They called it miner's consumption. We call it silicosis. Either name meant the same thing, a death sentence measured in years rather than seconds. A man might work the tunnels for a decade and emerge seemingly healthy. But the dust was already inside him. Within 5 years, the coughing would start. Within 10, he'd struggle to walk across a room. Within 15, he'd drown in his own fluids, lungs so scarred they could no longer process oxygen. The company doctors, when there were company doctors, recorded these deaths as natural causes: old age, weak constitution, consumption of the ordinary variety. The connection between rock dust and ruined lungs wasn't officially acknowledged until decades after the great tunnels were complete. But the workers knew. They couldn't name the mechanism, but they saw the pattern. The men who worked underground the longest died the youngest. The drill teams aged faster than the powder men, who aged faster than the surface crews. Something in the mountain was killing them, and they went back in anyway, because the pay was better than surface work, because their families needed to eat, because someone had to do it, and it might as well be them. Now, let's talk about what happened when they tried to speed things up. Black powder had been the standard explosive for centuries. Mixed properly, packed correctly, it could crack rock and loosen stone for removal. But it was weak. Against the hardest granite, black powder charges barely scratched the surface. You could blow charge after charge and gain only inches. In 1846, an Italian chemist named Ascanio Sobrero synthesized a new compound, nitroglycerin. It was 8 times more powerful than black powder. A single charge could do the work of a dozen. It could shatter granite that laughed at black powder. It was also catastrophically unstable. Nitroglycerin explodes when jarred, when heated, when looked at wrong. The slightest shock can detonate it: a dropped container, a sudden temperature change, a vibration transmitted through the floor. Any of these could turn a vial of clear liquid into a blast that erased everyone nearby. But the tunnel builders were desperate. They were years behind schedule. Investors were screaming. Every day of delay cost thousands of dollars. If nitroglycerin could speed the work, they would use nitroglycerin. The results were predictable. September 2nd, 1866. Hoosac Tunnel Central Shaft. A nitroglycerin magazine exploded without warning. The blast killed 13 men instantly, vaporizing some so completely that no remains were ever found. The shockwave collapsed 500 feet of tunnel. Debris rained from the shaft opening for a quarter mile. A witness named William Nash, working on the surface nearby, later described the moment. The ground jumped under my feet. Then the sound hit me. Not like thunder, bigger than thunder, like God had slammed a door on the world. Then the smoke came up out of the shaft, and the smoke was all that was left of 13 men. The company blamed improper storage. They continued using nitroglycerin. October 19, 1867, another explosion at Hoosac, 4 more dead. This time, investigators determined that the nitroglycerin had simply become unstable over time, as it always did if you kept it long enough. The company tightened storage procedures. They continued using nitroglycerin. In California, the Central Pacific Railroad was using nitroglycerin on Summit Tunnel. The Chinese laborers who handled it called it the shaking oil. They'd seen what it could do. They'd seen men disappear in white light and red mist. They knew that carrying it was a death sentence waiting for its moment. But they carried it anyway, because the bosses demanded it, because refusal meant dismissal, because the alternative was no work at all. And no work meant starvation for families back in Guangdong province who depended on their wages. A powder man named Ah Fook had carried nitroglycerin on Summit Tunnel for 8 months when his luck ended. The official record says only that he died in an explosion. No details, no witnesses, no investigation. Just one more Chinese name in a ledger full of Chinese names, each one representing a human being who was vaporized by unstable chemistry in the service of the railroad. The breakthrough came eventually with dynamite. Nitroglycerin stabilized by mixing it with diatomaceous earth. Alfred Nobel patented it in 1867, and by the early 1870s, it had largely replaced raw nitroglycerin in American tunnel construction. Dynamite was still dangerous, but it didn't explode if you dropped it. It didn't detonate if the temperature shifted. You could handle it like an ordinary tool, more or less, as long as you respected what it was. The men who died learning to handle raw nitroglycerin had been, in a sense, test subjects. Their deaths taught the industry what it needed to know. Their names filled the ledgers that nobody read. But here's who really built these tunnels. And here's why their story has been buried even deeper than the tunnels themselves. Chinese laborers carved Summit Tunnel. This isn't disputed. The Central Pacific Railroad employed between 10,000 and 15,000 Chinese workers at the peak of construction, and they did the most dangerous work on the most difficult sections of track. What's less often discussed is how they did it. The approach to Summit Tunnel required cutting a roadbed into the face of Cape Horn, a sheer granite cliff rising 1,400 feet above the American River Canyon. There was no way to access the rock face from above or below. The cliffs were too steep to climb, too sheer to scaffold. So the Chinese workers wove baskets from reeds. They climbed to the cliff top. They lowered themselves over the edge in these baskets, hanging over a 1,000-foot drop, dangling in the wind while they drilled blast holes in solid granite. Let that image settle for a moment. A man in a wicker basket, suspended by a rope, drilling into rock while the world drops away beneath him. His only safety is the strength of the weave and the reliability of the men holding the rope above. If the basket fails, he falls. If the rope slips, he falls. If the men above lose their grip, he falls. After drilling the holes, the basket workers packed them with black powder. They lit the fuses, and then they signaled frantically to be hauled up before the charges blew. Sometimes they were hauled up in time, sometimes they weren't. No one recorded how many Chinese workers died on Cape Horn. The Central Pacific didn't keep detailed records of Chinese casualties the way they tracked white worker deaths. Estimates range from several dozen to several hundred, just on that one cliff face alone. A white supervisor named Strobridge later said, with something like admiration, "They're not afraid of anything. You couldn't get white men to work in those baskets." He meant it as a compliment. He didn't ask whether the Chinese workers were unafraid or whether they simply had no choice. The Summit Tunnel itself, the 1,659-foot bore through the mountain, was carved almost entirely by Chinese labor. They worked in shifts around the clock, attacking the heading from both ends simultaneously. Progress was measured in inches. The winter of 1866 to 67 buried the work camps in 40 feet of snow, and the Chinese workers simply dug tunnels through the snow to reach the rock tunnels beneath. They lived in those snow tunnels for months. Avalanches killed dozens of them, bodies not recovered until spring thaw, if they were recovered at all. A slide in February 1867 buried an entire work camp. The number of dead remains unknown. The company recorded it as an unfortunate incident. When the tunnel finally broke through in August 1867, the two headings met almost perfectly, off by less than 2 inches horizontally, after boring 1,659 feet from each end. It was an engineering triumph, a mathematical marvel. The newspapers credited the engineers. The investors celebrated. The Chinese workers, who had carved every inch of that tunnel by hand, were not mentioned. But at least Summit Tunnel was eventually finished. At least the work eventually ended. The Hoosac Tunnel seemed, at times, like it would kill men forever. Hoosac broke the men who tried to build it, and it broke the men who paid for them. The original contractors, a firm called Haupt and Company, went bankrupt trying to dig the tunnel. The second set of contractors followed them into ruin. The state of Massachusetts took over the project, poured millions into the mountain, and still the tunnel resisted. 24 years of construction, $370 million in modern currency, and deaths beyond counting, because the record-keeping was haphazard and the companies had no incentive to track their casualties accurately. The official death toll is 195. Everyone who studies the tunnel knows the real number is far higher. A minister named William Rice kept his own count. Visiting the tunnel works regularly to provide spiritual comfort to the workers. His private ledger, discovered decades later, unlisted 283 deaths that he personally witnessed or was called to bless. And Rice missed some years. He didn't see every death. His count was incomplete. Modern historians estimate between 500 and 1,000 deaths over the project's duration. We'll never know the true number. Too many men fell into shafts that were never excavated. Too many bodies were buried in collapses that were never cleared. Too many immigrants died without families to ask questions or names to put on stones. A man named Ringo Kelly died in a blast that should have been routine. He'd packed the charge correctly. He'd checked the fuse. But something went wrong. A spark, a fault in the fuse. Something, and the blast caught him still at the face. The force threw him 50 feet back down the tunnel. When his crew reached him, he was still alive. He died 2 hours later, apologizing for delaying the work. A crew of 13 men died in the 1866 nitroglycerin explosion. We know their number, we don't know all their names. The company listed 11 of them. The other 2 were apparently too new or too transient to make it into the records. They died just as dead as their named companions, but history doesn't remember them. A pumping station, collapsed in 1868, drowned 3 men in groundwater that flooded the lower sections of the tunnel. The pumps failed, the water rose, and the men couldn't get out in time. A rescue team found them 3 days later, floating in the dark. And always, the dust. The men who survived the explosions and the collapses and the falls still breathe the dust, their lungs filled with granite particles too small to see. The mountain killed them slowly, over years, long after they'd left the tunnel behind. The breakthrough came on Thanksgiving Day, 1873, not the final breakthrough, but the meeting of the headings. Crews working from east and west finally connected, after 18 years of labor. So the alignment was nearly perfect, 4 inches off and 25,000 feet, an engineering marvel. The tunnel wouldn't actually open for rail traffic until 1875, after 2 more years of finishing work. But the hard part was done. The mountain had been pierced. A celebration was planned. Dignitaries arrived. Speeches were prepared. The workers didn't attend. Most of them were too sick or too exhausted or too dead to celebrate. Now let's talk about what those deaths purchased. And what remains of their labor today. The Hoosac Tunnel is still in use. 150 years after Bernard Donahue said about damn time, freight trains still roll through that 5-mile bore. The granite walls that took 24 years to carve still stand. The drainage systems that generations of engineers refined still function. The tunnel still works, every day, moving goods across a mountain that once seemed impassable. If you drive to the town of Florida, in Massachusetts, yes, there's a Florida in Massachusetts, you can see the West Portal. The entrance is massive, carved stone, almost ceremonial in its proportions. A plaque near the entrance mentions the workers who died. It doesn't list their names, there isn't room. The East Portal is smaller, less dramatic, but equally functional. Trains enter one side of the mountain and emerge from the other. And most passengers, if passenger trains still use the route, would never know that they were passing through a mass grave. Because that's what Hoosac is. The collapsed sections were never fully excavated. The bodies buried in the 1866 explosion were never recovered. The men who fell into shafts, who were sealed behind collapses, who simply disappeared into the rock, they're still there. The tunnel passes through them, or around them, or over them. Summit Tunnel still operates too. And freight trains on the original Central Pacific route, now Union Pacific, still pass through the 1,659-foot bore that Chinese laborers carved by hand. The granite walls still bear the marks of drill bits and powder charges. The alignment is still within 2 inches of perfect 157 years after the breakthrough. The tunnels that men died to build are still earning money, still moving cargo, still serving the economy that their builders never lived to see. And here's what we owe them. And here's what we've lost. And here's why this history matters. Every tunnel dug today uses techniques refined through the deaths of those early workers. The drill jumbos that bore through rock are descendants of the handheld bits that men like James Callahan gripped while hammers fell. The explosives that shatter granite are the great-grandchildren of the nitroglycerin that vaporized Ah Fook and the 13 men in the Hoosac shaft. We've eliminated most of the danger. Modern tunnel workers operate in controlled environments with ventilation systems that remove dust, with explosives that don't detonate unexpectedly, with monitoring equipment that detects instability before collapses occur. A tunnel worker today might go an entire career without seeing a fatality. The men who built Hoosac saw fatalities monthly. That's progress, that's safety engineering, that's the accumulated wisdom of industries that learned inch by inch what killed workers and how to prevent it. But the learning had a price. The workers who died in the early tunnels were, in effect, teaching the industry through their deaths. Every explosion that killed a powder man taught engineers something about storage and handling. Every collapse that buried a crew taught architects something about shoring and support. Every silicosis case that destroyed a driller's lungs taught doctors something about ventilation and dust control. The lessons were written in blood and carved in bone. The men who died didn't know they were teaching. They were just trying to earn a wage, just trying to survive another shift, just trying to make progress through rock that didn't care whether they lived or died. We've gained so much from their sacrifice. We've gained tunnels that carry the commerce of nations. We've gained engineering knowledge that makes modern construction possible. We've gained safety standards that protect the workers who came after. What we've lost is harder to name. Those men knew rock in ways we never will. They could read a granite face like a text, seeing weaknesses and fault lines that instruments might miss. They could feel the mountain's resistance through the handle of a drill, could sense when stone was about to give or when it would hold forever. They understood in their bodies the physics of pressure and percussion and fracture. A steel driver named Marcus Chen, one of the few Chinese workers whose name survived in the records, supposedly could tell by the ring of his hammer whether a drill hole was approaching a void or a hard inclusion. He'd been at it so long that the sound told him things no measurement could reveal. He worked Summit Tunnel for 3 years and survived, one of the lucky ones. What he knew died with him, decades later, in a boarding house in Sacramento. No one thought to write it down. The foremen who ran those tunnel crews understood men in ways that modern managers might not. They knew that fear and exhaustion made mistakes, that a crew worked better when it trusted its leaders, that pushing too hard for too long produced diminishing returns measured in injuries and deaths. They learned personnel management the hard way through disasters that taught them what happened when they got it wrong. And the workers themselves understood something that we've mostly forgotten: the cost of progress. They paid that cost daily in pain and dust and terror. They knew every shift that the railroad they were building would run over them, figuratively and sometimes literally. They did the work anyway because someone had to, and they were the ones who were there. We live in a world their labor built. The tunnels still carry trains. The routes they pioneered still move freight. The technology they tested, at the cost of their lives, still underpins construction projects around the world. Here's to the steel drivers, the men who held the drill while hammers fell, trusting their partners with their hands and their lives, inch by inch through granite that had stood for 400 million years. Here's to the powder men, who packed charges into holes they'd drilled, who lit fuses and ran and prayed, who knew that every blast might be the one that didn't wait for them to get clear. Here's to the muckers, the shovelers, the haulers, the men who cleared broken stone and made room for the next crew, who worked in darkness and dust while the mountain pressed down from above. Here's to the basketmen, the Chinese laborers who hung over 1,000-foot drops in woven reeds, drilling into cliff faces, placing charges, signaling for a rescue that sometimes came too late. Here's to the foremen who stayed in the tunnels with their crews, who didn't ask men to face dangers they wouldn't face themselves, who carried the burden of decisions that sent men to their deaths. Here's to the unnamed, the unremembered, the bodies never recovered, the names never recorded, the men who exist now only as numbers in ledgers, as increments in death tolls, as ghosts in granite that still echoes with their labor. If you take Amtrak through the Berkshires, you might pass through Hoosac. The train enters darkness, the windows go black, and for a few minutes, you're inside the mountain. The walls that flicker past in the occasional light were carved by hand, chip by chip, death by death. If you ride freight through the Sierra Nevada, you might pass through Summit. The granite that surrounds you was drilled by men in wicker baskets, men whose names we mostly don't know. Men who came from across the Pacific to build a railroad that didn't want them once the building was done. The tunnels don't advertise their history. There are no announcements, no commemorations, no moments of silence as the trains pass through. The tunnels just work, the way they've worked for 150 years, carrying passengers and freight through mountains that once seemed impassable. But the history is there. The dust of dead men is in that stone. The echoes of hammer strikes still resonate if you know how to listen. The debt we owe is carved into every inch of those passages. We didn't build this world. They did. We just inherited it. A few years ago, maintenance crews working in the Hoosac Tunnel found something embedded in the wall, a hand drill, still stuck in the hole it had been working when it was abandoned. The steel was rusted, but intact. The shape was still clear. Some worker, more than a century ago, Yuan had been drilling that hole when something stopped him. A shift change, an accident, a death. We don't know? The drill is still there, the work is still unfinished. In a tunnel 5 miles long, carved over 24 years, there are probably dozens of such artifacts, tools left behind, holes never completed, evidence of labor interrupted and never resumed. The mountain keeps what it takes. The tunnels remember what we've forgotten. And the trains still roll through every day, she carrying the commerce of a nation through passages carved by men whose names we'll never know, whose faces we'll never see, whose sacrifice made everything that came after possible. If these stories matter to you, subscribe. There are more tunnels to explore, more names to rescue from the ledgers, more history buried in stone, waiting for someone to dig it out. The mountains still stand, the tunnels still pierce them. And the ghosts of the men who built them still wait in the darkness, listening for the trains that never stop coming.